I have determined that it is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
It was perhaps the most controversial decision of his first year in office. And now President Trump says the future of Jerusalem is off the table in future peace negotiations. There's been a backlash at the United Nations where the US administration has used threats and bullying to try to win support. So is Donald Trump playing politics with Middle East peace, or is this the true face of US policy? Hello, I'm Ghida Fakhry, and you're watching a special program looking at the Jerusalem question. Hello from Washington, D.C. Since Donald Trump entered the White House here, it has been a year of drama and disruption. And of all of the U.S. president's controversial decisions, one stands out. Recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital upturned 70 years of American policy and has caused outcry and condemnation right around the world. At first, President Trump said his decision would not affect any final status issues to be negotiated between Israelis and Palestinians. But now he says Jerusalem is off the table. On the program, we'll look at the impact of Trump's style and substance on America's international standing and the prospects for peace in the Middle East. But first, Frank Gucciardo reports on the reaction of the United Nations to the Trump administration's blunt attempt to win votes there.
Getting support at the United Nations for the controversial Jerusalem decision was never going to be easy, but now the U.S. stands accused of using bullying and threats. Last month, U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, tweeted this warning to other nations. At the UN, we're always asked to do more and give more, so when we make a decision at the will of the American people about where to locate our embassy, we don't expect those we've helped to target us. On Thursday, there will be a vote criticizing our choice. The U.S. will be taking names.
A recorded vote has been requested.
The response was defiant. 128 nations voting in the General Assembly to declare the U.S. recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital as null and void. Botswana's UN ambassador was among those who voted for the resolution.
Of course, that was a threat to countries, just to ensure that the Americans had to do this in order to ensure that countries are conscious of the consequences that may arise out of the way they will vote. Well, basically one gets a sense that the US wants to use its enormous political and economic power to arm twist countries to toe their line as far as the Middle East situation is concerned.
And many foreign policy experts like Warren Hogue have expressed concern over the Trump administration acting alone and sidestepping diplomacy.
To the extent that the unilateral naming of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel militates against a multilateral solution to the situation in Israel-Palestine, we obviously are against it because we believe everything should be done to facilitate and empower and promote multilateral solutions.
8 nations, including Israel, backed the United States at the UN vote against the resolution. Many of those received large amounts of U.S. foreign aid, including Guatemala, which announced that it will also move its embassy to Jerusalem. Many legal experts say that the U.S. moving its embassy to Jerusalem violates international law and resolutions agreed to here at the United Nations. And no matter how many other countries do the same, it will not make Jerusalem the legal capital of Israel. 1 year into the Trump administration, its diplomatic moves, like the one on Jerusalem, have left it looking more isolated and less like a leader of the international community. Frank Gucciardo, TRT World, the United Nations.
And President Trump has carried through on another of his threats to withhold funding for Palestinian aid programs. $65 million is being frozen from the budget of the UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA. To talk more about Trump's approach, let's bring in our guest. David Pollock is from the Washington Institute. He used to be a senior advisor for the broader Middle East of the State Department. And Hadi Amr is a former U.S. Deputy Special Envoy for Israeli and Palestinian negotiations and currently with the Brookings Institution. Hadi, to you first. As a former State Department official working on this issue,
Sure.
How surprised were you by the attempts made and carried out of the UN ambassador the new tactics that were being employed in withholding funding to countries that would dare to stand against the United States on Jerusalem?
I think, first of all, I was very surprised at Trump's announcement, which I think is contrary to U.S. interest. We sort of angered allies and got nothing for it. And then at the UN, I was also very surprised at the tactic. The irony here is that by trying to bully nations around the world, they actually caused countries like Canada, who would have probably supported Israel at the UN, to abstain on the resolution. So when you compare the results of the UN vote under Trump versus UN votes under Obama, ironically, Obama did a far better job at shielding Israel from criticism than Donald Trump did.
And just how permanent do you think is the damage done to the global standing of the U.S., but also to the prospects of peace between the two nations?
I think, in the first instance, as an American, I'm very concerned about our status and our standing, but not only because of the Jerusalem decision, but because of so many decisions around the world. I think this actually fits in with Trump's policy of trying to disrupt the ordinary way of doing business. In terms of the peace process, look, I think right now there are no prospects for peace. The Palestinian leadership has said they've pulled out. I think the UN vote preceded by the Arab League, or the Organization of the Islamic Conference vote, shows that Muslim countries, Arab countries, the international community just does not support the U.S. or Israel in this.
Would it have been worth it, though, for the United States in the long term? You've got people like former Defense Secretary Robert Gates saying it was an ill-advised move. He doesn't think Israel has ever been a grateful ally, and he doesn't think that it serves the U.S.'s interest necessarily to pursue what Israel wants.
Well, I agree with that, but I don't think that really has much bearing on this decision. This was something that President Trump promised to do during his campaign. He was elected president. He is, as Ambassador Nikki Haley said, carrying out the will of the American people by making this decision.
So was that a good enough reason, do you think, Hadi?
Look, I think for President Trump wasn't the first person to promise this. Presidents Clinton, other presidents promised this. What they discovered when they got into office is that it didn't make sense. It doesn't serve U.S. foreign policy interests. It doesn't serve our national security. And I believe it also doesn't serve Israel's national security interests. I think Israel, as the UN vote is evidence, is less protected by the U.S. because of this decision. The U.S. is no longer viewed by the Palestinians, by the Arab world, by the Muslim world, even by the Europeans as a legitimate negotiator and mediator in this process. And so I think ultimately it also undermines Israel's interest to sort of blatantly display a particular U.S. bias. Let's not forget that the Palestinians entered negotiations on the basis that all issues would be final status issues, including Jerusalem.
And they have, I presume, they now feel really let down and humiliated by the fact that the United States did not live up to these assurances that it gave.
I think that's right, and I think that's why we're seeing these sort of very negative reactions out of the Palestinian leadership. It's unclear what options the Palestinian leadership has. Are they going to abandon two states? Are they going to abandon the peace process in general? Are they simply just going to abandon the U.S. as a negotiator? We'll have to see in the days and weeks ahead how they proceed.
All right, well, let's perhaps just have a quick look at how President Trump's position on Jerusalem has changed within a matter of weeks. In December, when he made the announcement, he insisted that recognizing the city as Israel's capital had nothing to do with a future peace deal.
We want an agreement that is a great deal for the Israelis and a great deal for the Palestinians. We are not taking a position of any final status issues, including the specific boundaries of the Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem or the resolution of contested borders.
So President Trump insisting there that the U.S. is not taking a position on those key elements of a peace deal. But at the start of the year, we had these words from him in a tweet. He said, "It's not only Pakistan that we pay billions of dollars to for nothing, but also many other countries and others. As an example, we pay the Palestinians hundreds of millions of dollars a year and get no appreciation or respect. They don't even want to negotiate a long overdue peace treaty with Israel. We have taken Jerusalem, the toughest part of the negotiation, off the table, but Israel, for that, would have had to pay more. But with the Palestinians no longer willing to talk peace, why should we make any of these massive future payments to them? So there you have it, David Pollock. Quite a bit of a blatant blackmailing going on there, it sounds like. The Palestinians being penalized for not coming to the table, for not showing appreciation to the Americans. Does the United States get the respect and appreciation it needs from Israel?
Yes.
On the other hand, no, because there are billions of dollars worth of military and economic aid that goes to Israel every year, despite the fact that the Americans have often said that the building of settlement is not is not helpful. Nothing's changed.
Right. But as you say, that
they don't get penalized. Is what I'm getting at.
You're supporting blackmail against Israel, but not against the Palestinians.
What I'm suggesting is, I wonder if you think that the Israelis, on the other hand, have shown gratefulness.
Yes, I think they do.
In
many
what way?
ways,
in
not
what
in
way?
every single issue all the time.
Just name one or two when it comes to Israel.
They are a loyal ally of the United States in the United Nations, unlike many of these other countries. And they are a loyal partner of the United States in intelligence and counterterrorism and overall strategy in the Middle East. And they support their neighboring countries, Egypt and Jordan, with intelligence and security cooperation. And those are also loyal and important allies of the United States. So I don't think this is an issue of partnership with Israel. If you're talking about Jerusalem, I think the Palestinians are making a terrible mistake by boycotting the negotiations. And I predict...
Do they have any choice, though?
Yeah, of course they have a choice. They could choose to come back to the negotiations at any moment. And I predict that they will probably do that. But who would
lead these negotiations, though, if the U.S. isn't able to do it anymore?
We don't need a mediator. We need direct negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians.
Is that the way you see the future of peace efforts?
Look, I think, as the Palestinians have said, they will not. The Palestinian leadership has said they will not work with the United States on negotiations. I tend to agree.
And we've heard that threat before. Will they carry through on it?
I think it's difficult for them to face their society and do it at this time. But I also think, what's really interesting is what Trump said. And if you look at, this is getting down in the weeds, but if you look at the press conference that Assistant Secretary Satterfield did a few days after Trump, he said, look, there's actually been no real change in the U.S. views on Jerusalem. There's been no specific views on Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem. So the irony here is the Palestinians, the Arabs, and the Muslims got all upset about no real actual very limited technical change on the part of the United States. There's been an issue that, U.S. citizens born in Jerusalem, for example, their passport cannot say born in Israel because the United States does not view Jerusalem as part of Israel. The Assistant Secretary said that has not changed. So there actually has not been much of a technical change in terms of U.S. views on Jerusalem. That's the irony here. A big show, but limited change on the ground.
More theater than substance, do you agree?
Yeah, I do.
So why the timing, though? Why now?
The timing. The timing, I think, had everything to do with American domestic politics and almost nothing to do with U.S. foreign policy. And I think that when Trump's subsequent statements seemed to me to be a clumsy but well-intentioned attempt to get back to peace negotiations, he's implying that if the Palestinians do come back to the table, that there will be a lot in it for them from the United States.
So you're saying everything to do with domestic politics and not much else, but I wonder, Hadi Ahmed, if you would also see it in a more sort of Middle Eastern geopolitical strategic way as well, with now all of these winds driving towards somewhat of a rapprochement between Israel and the Gulf countries. At their forefront, Saudi Arabia, in an anti-Iran coalition that the U.S. seems to be wanting to build.
Sure. Look, I think there's clearly a lot going on in the Middle East. There's a lot going on in terms of U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia, with Iran. There's a lot going there. But I think at the end of the day, what Saudi leaders, what Arab leaders have discovered is that Jerusalem in particular is a highly sensitive, emotional issue that Muslims and Christians in the Arab world feel. And so by messing with that, they've actually made it more difficult for Saudis, Emiratis, Egyptians to have that rapprochement with Israel that the U.S. wanted. So again, I really believe that President Trump, through these actions, did a huge disservice, not only to peace, not only to the United States, but also to Israel.
But he knew he could get away with it.
I don't,
because there's a real sense of apathy, it seems now.
No, I just don't think they calculated well. Look, I think unfortunately we have a president who has no experience in foreign policy. We have key advisors to him that have no experience in foreign policy. We have a U.S. representative to the United Nations who has no experience in foreign policy, and they completely misread the terrain in this regard. And so I think this is a bumbling of novices.
A lack of understanding of the intricacies, do you think, of the conflict, with so many inexperienced people, as you say, in charge?
I don't agree,
no?
Actually.
How do you see it? Just in a final word or two.
I agree that many of the people involved are inexperienced, and probably President Trump himself doesn't understand all of the nuances and the details. But I don't agree.
Should we be alarmed then? Should you be alarmed as an
because
American?
in this case, I actually don't think that they miscalculated at all. I think they knew that there would be opposition. I think they calculated that the opposition would be short-lived and mostly symbolic, and I think they're right.
David Pollock, Hadi Ahmed, thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Palestinian anger at President Trump remains at boiling point because of this decision. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas said they would never accept the decision on Jerusalem.
Now we said no to Trump and others. No, we will not accept his project. We told him the deal of the century is the slab of the century, and we will retaliate.
And around the world, there's been little support for the U.S.'s shift on Jerusalem. In a moment, Juan Lamas is in Venezuela with the latest from Latin America. Courtney Keeley is in Turkey with more on the reaction there. But first, to Asad Beg in London with a view from the UK and Europe.
There's not been much support here in the UK or in Europe for Trump's latest announcement. British Prime Minister Theresa May said that her government disagreed with the decision and that the UK had no plans to move its embassy from Tel Aviv, where it's based, and that they still consider East Jerusalem as occupied territories. French President Emmanuel Macron said that the move was regrettable, whilst the spokesman for German Chancellor Angela Merkel took to Twitter and said that Berlin did not support the US position. The message is that the status of Jerusalem should be decided through a negotiated settlement and as part of a two-state solution. Most have expressed concerns over the impact of Trump's announcement on peace, with even Pope Francis weighing into the debate, who said that he was deeply concerned at the situation and urged people to respect the status quo in line with UN resolutions.
The reaction here was swift, with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan calling for an emergency summit of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Influential leaders from 57 Muslim-majority countries soon converged here in Istanbul. They rejected U.S. President Donald Trump's declaration that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. President Erdogan said the status of Jerusalem is a red line for Muslims and called Trump's statement provocative. He said Israel is guilty of an illegal occupation, seizure of property, and disproportionate use of violence. And President Erdogan also said in his remarks in late December that he wished Trump had called him first and believes that Trump would not have made such a mistake if he had consulted with him.
Here in Venezuela and across Latin America, there has been widespread criticism of the Jerusalem move. President Nicolás Maduro called Trump's announcement irrational, illegal, and a true provocation, even flying to Turkey to take part in December's emergency summit of Muslim leaders in Istanbul. He said Trump's decision was in essence a declaration of war against the good people of the world. Bolivia's President Evo Morales also condemned the move, sending a message of solidarity to the Palestinian people, while Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, Suriname and Cuba all voted against the decision at the United Nations. Trump can count on some regional support here, though. Guatemala and Honduras were two of the small number of nations to side with the U.S. in that vote, while Mexico, the U.S.'s southern neighbor, was among those to abstain.
President Trump may have faced opposition even within his own administration on Jerusalem, but to others, he has now delivered on a long-standing promise. And among the supporters who helped to drive the decision, one group stands out. The new policy is being hailed as a win by evangelical Christians here in the US, and their support matters to the president. More than 25% of people in the United States identify as evangelical Christians, and 81% of them voted to put Trump in office. More than half, 53%, support the switch of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. That's compared with 63% of all voters who oppose the Jerusalem move. So joining me now for more on this is Christopher Rolston, Associate Professor of ancient Semitic languages at George Washington University here in Washington. Professor Rolston, so we've been talking about how influential the push from the evangelicals here in the US has been to make this Jerusalem decision happen. Without that, would Trump have taken this decision, do you think?
It's difficult to know what Trump would or wouldn't have done without that support, but I suspect that indeed that support was really instrumental in his decision to do this.
How important is this group of people? When we refer to evangelicals, we showed the numbers on screen a few moments ago, but just how influential have they been?
During the past 30 or 40 years, evangelicals have been very strong and very politically active, and so there's no doubt about the fact that this was part of the equation for Trump.
Is there a certain subset among the evangelicals that is particularly active when it comes to Israel, or is it something that all evangelicals feel strongly about?
Jerusalem, of course, is sacred to Christians and Jews and Muslims, of course, but it's especially an important political development for a certain subset of evangelicals, especially those that are often referred to as premillennialists or dispensationalists.
Are they often referred to as Christian Zionists as well? Is this the same group of people?
Right. There is, in essence, within the subset of Christianity called premillennialism, a lot of them are indeed Zionists. And they believe that the establishment of the State of Israel was actually the fulfillment of biblical prophecy.
Right. And there's that belief as well, if you could explain a little bit more about, for us, the history that goes with it. The fact that God will bless the U.S. if it blesses Israel. This is something that is often cited by evangelicals.
Sure. There's sort of the assumption among certain segments of Christianity that, in essence, the U.S. is in almost a covenant relationship with ancient Israel, and therefore, for some, modern Israel as well.
But today has it taken on a different notion, though? I mean, is it still a theological movement, or is it now morphed into something else with a lot of strong political underpinning?
I think there's no doubt about the fact that evangelicalism in general has become deeply political. Yeah. It's been happening for the past 30 or 40 years. Mm-hmm. It's definitely part of the equation now. Some of these premillennialist Christians, for example, firmly believe that the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 was the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. They also believe that this is, in essence, the precursor to Armageddon, and also, therefore, the precursor, according to them, of the second coming of Jesus of Nazareth to earth.
Right. But when you fast forward to today and the way they feel about Jerusalem and this recognition, a lot of people took note that Trump, in his December 6th announcement, had stopped short from recognizing Israeli claims to East Jerusalem, saying that we're not taking a position on any final status issues, including the specific boundaries of Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem. And then there was that tweet. Did that emanate from a certain push that was made, do you think, by evangelicals to take the step further?
I think that evangelicals generally, and premillennialists in particular, don't parse the language of, for example, UN Resolution 181 very carefully, and so don't know that Jerusalem was to be a capital for both the Jewish state, the state of Israel,
that is
as
the
well as the
partition
Palestinian.
town.
That's right. They often don't know about that. There's also sort of a fair amount of lack of knowledge about the fact that there are even Arab Christians, for example, in Jerusalem. So you'll actually find evangelical Christians or Christians in general who are not aware of that. Therefore, the end result is, in essence, when they think of Jerusalem, they think of it solely as a state or as a capital for Israel.
So for them, how central is anything to do with Israel, not just Jerusalem, but Israel? So when you look at what matters to them as voters in U.S. elections, does Israel come on top of every list of priorities way before tax reform, let's say, in healthcare and the rest of it?
I think that probably for certain people, sure. For others, no. In other words, evangelicals, premillennialists are not sort of a unified block in some fashion. So certainly for some of them, this would be paramount. For some, it wouldn't be paramount.
And just a final thought on how, at least the most active elements among this grouping must be feeling now that they have at the White House Donald Trump and Vice President Mike Pence, who a lot of people associate with this movement. I mean, these are two quite sympathetic politicians to their needs and interests, I presume.
Right. I think that evangelicals across the board, including the subset known as premillennialists, are very pleased at the fact that they have somebody in the White House they consider to be an ally with regard to these sorts of things. Absolutely.
All right. Professor Christopher Ralston of George Washington University, thank you very much.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
For sharing your insights. Thank you. Still ahead, has the main path to peace now reached a dead end? And what comes next? We'll look at the impact of the Jerusalem decision.
I think it's been the case that the two-state resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian issue has been dead for quite some time, and that official Washington has recognized the two-state resolution to be dead.
Welcome back. When President Trump decided to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, the Palestinians said the U.S. was no longer an honest peace broker. And when he threatened to withhold aid from them, they told him Jerusalem was not for sale. But the freezing of that funding is not the only way that aid is being used to buy influence in the Jerusalem dispute. James Champion has our 5 facts.
The United States is the world's biggest foreign aid donor. It gave out more than $44 billion in 2017, though that will be drastically cut back this year to less than $26 billion. The US has decided to cut off some Palestinian aid over the Jerusalem dispute. It gives the Palestinians more than $350 million a year through UN agency UNRWA. But when Palestinian leaders criticized President Trump over Jerusalem, he froze $65 million worth of funding. Israel, on the other hand, gets billions of dollars annually from the US. This year's budget allows for more than $3 billion, mostly in the form of military aid. Countries that have backed the US on Jerusalem rely on US aid. Apart from Israel, there were 7 countries that voted with the US at the UN in December, many of them impoverished, smaller nations which also get funding from Israel and would be hit hard by a significant loss of cash. And the US cut funding to the UN just days after that UN vote on Jerusalem. The US will be cutting at least $285 million from its UN funding. In a statement, Ambassador Nikki Haley didn't mention Jerusalem but said, "The inefficiency and overspending of the United Nations are well known. We will no longer let the generosity of the American people be taken advantage of or remain unchecked."
Let's talk more now about this with P.J. Crowley. He was spokesman for the State Department during the Obama administration. P.J. Crowley, listening to Nikki Haley's threats at the United Nations, is it an entirely new way of doing business these days at the State Department among U.S. diplomats, or is it simply a very open way of doing it?
Well, it's not a new way. The United States has had its issues with the United Nations before, in the late 1990s with Senator Jesse Helms, spearheading an effort to withdraw funding from the United Nations. I certainly think that the greatest challenge here is that we're 1 year into a Trump administration, and there's a lack of clarity as to what the U.S. policy actually is. And if you think you know what it is, does it survive the next presidential statement or the next presidential tweet? As we sit here, there's a debate going on between the President of the United States and his chief of staff. His chief of staff said, well, many of his campaign positions were uninformed. And the president says, no, that's not true. So I think that there's a lot of what the president is doing is pursuing what he feels is his electoral mandate. Right. He's keeping faith with his own political base. But I think domestic politics are driving U.S. policy right now much more significant than U.S. interests.
And interesting that he went ahead with his Jerusalem declaration despite the very serious reservations of his entire national security team.
Well, I mean, let's step back for a little bit of context. If you're an optimist, you would say that the peace process is in a coma. If you're a pessimist, you'd say it's moribund. But the reality of the peace process, is that there is a complete lack of trust between the Israelis and the Palestinians, today. So, there was little prospect of progress, despite the president's interest in the ultimate deal. Now the question is, did the president's pronouncement, make it even more difficult to achieve progress? Undoubtedly, the answer is yes.
And he set the peace process, you think, back quite far.
Well, he
from what
certainly
you've
has
seen.
complicated the efforts of his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who's now charged with creating a path forward. I think this was a questionable idea, badly executed. I mean, the president could have plausibly taken a complex issue like Jerusalem and advanced it, had he said, for example, that I recognize that West Jerusalem is the capital of the Israeli state, and I recognize that East Jerusalem will be the capital of a Palestinian state.
And gotten something in return.
You might have said, well, that's interesting, but that's not what he did. So now what he's done is he's emboldened, particularly Israeli officials who are skeptical of a two-state solution, and obviously the Palestinians are going to retaliate.
And you could argue there's absolutely no more incentive for the Israelis to come to the negotiating table, despite all the pressure that's being applied on the Palestinians.
I mean, what you're hinting at is the ultimate deal maker, gave something to the Israelis, got nothing in return.
And it was probably the ace card in his possession. I mean, Jerusalem, many people will say, was the most important card anyone had.
The president, not surprisingly, has among his contradictories, he said, he's on the one hand, I'd like to make a deal. On the other hand, he also believed that the Obama administration was too harsh towards Israel. So it's clear that is President Trump going to lean on the Netanyahu government, to stop with the appropriation of land in East Jerusalem? The answer is no.
Let me ask you, was the Obama administration too harsh on Israel? I mean, there was that one incident, I believe, when you were at the State Department acting as spokesman for Hillary Clinton, where there was that sort of rebuke that she had towards Netanyahu. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, over 8 years, clearly, President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu had a very, very difficult relationship. You could easily say they disliked each other immensely. But behind the scenes, the reality is that the level of strategic cooperation between the United States and Israel over 8 years advanced significantly. Particularly the establishment of the Iron Dome, which has been very, very significant in terms of defending Israel from attacks, from Hamas. So it's misleading to personalize, the relationship as President Trump has. It is a close relationship.
But there was that incident where Secretary Hillary Clinton had a problem with Netanyahu carrying on with the building of settlements. But did she threaten to withhold or even suspend?
There was an announcement during Vice President Biden's time that embarrassed the administration, and Netanyahu responded with a limited moratorium on new housing construction. By the same token, at that particular time, it was President Abbas who was unable to respond meaningfully, and the process ran out of time.
But of course, there was no suggestion of suspending aid to Israel in any way as a result.
No American administration has done that, going back to the Bush administration in between 1989 and 1992.
And so when the United States withholds funding for the Palestinians, when it cuts funding to them and to UNRWA, which provides a lot of basic services to Palestinian refugees, not just in the West Bank and Gaza, but also in Lebanon, in Jordan, in other such countries, what does it do to the kind of instability that it creates for the United States' interests around the world and for that region?
Well, I mean, it calls into question the future of the Oslo process, and that's the pivot point where we find ourselves today. It's not to say that the peace process is going to advance. It is unlikely to advance until there's new leadership on both the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. But the danger here is if the Oslo process indeed is dead, where do the parties go from here? And that's the ultimate danger for both the Israelis and the Palestinians. And it was remarkable in his first meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu, where President Trump expressed ambivalence about whether there's a two-state solution or a one-state solution. It made you question, here's a man who has no respect for detail, and he's walking into the middle of arguably the most complex diplomatic challenge.
So was it just was it a casual remark, or is there a shift now toward the one-state solution?
Well, I think it's a dangerous remark in that if there is no two-state solution, given the imbalance of strength on the Israeli side, weakness on the Palestinian side, then something that the Obama administration cautioned Israel about repeatedly is be careful what you wish for, because if you get to the point where it's in fact a one-state solution, then Israel has to decide
a democratic state.
Is it willing to be a Jewish state or a democratic state? But it can't be both. That's the reality that the United States needs to help Israel avoid.
PJ Crowley, former State Department spokesman, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Thank you. Well, since the peace process began, the U.S. has always given its full backing to a two-state solution. Until now, Israelis and Palestinians living side by side, each with a country of their own. But as we've just been saying, under Trump, even that seems to have changed. The president says he is now open to another option, one nation home to both peoples. We spoke to Josh Rubner from the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. He discusses our big idea that it's time to talk about a one-state solution in Israel and Palestine.
I think it's been the case that the two-state resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian issue has been dead for quite some time, and that official Washington has recognized the two-state resolution to be dead. If you don't agree that ethnic cleansing is an option, and I hope that all conscious people would not agree to that as a resolution, that there can only be one other solution. If there's not going to be a sovereign state for Palestinians, there has to be a shared political entity. Then instead of continued Israeli apartheid, yes, a creative, fair and just resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian issue has to involve some form of one-state resolution and single democratic entity where Palestinians and Israeli Jews have equal rights. Well, it's true that Israeli Jews don't want to see a transformation into a democracy where Palestinians have equal rights to Israeli Jews. But that's not what is important. What is important is fundamental issues of fairness, justness, and the dismantling of Israel's separate and unequal apartheid regime. The United States has never been an honest broker to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Dating all the way back to the Ford administration, there's been an agreement between the United States and Israel that the United States will pre-coordinate with Israel its positions in the negotiating room. And these pre-cooked and preconceived notions are always to the detriment of the Palestinians and always to the benefit of Israel.
Well, among those questioning the wisdom of President Trump's decision are many in America's own Jewish community. The Jerusalem policy of the Trump administration has sharply divided opinion here. So let's talk to our guests. In New York is Morton Klein, the president of the Zionist Organization of America. And here in Washington is Deborah Shushan, Director of Policy and Government Relations at Americans for Peace Now. Dr. Shushan, let me begin with you. American Jews were far from united behind Trump's decision. You yourself have called it reckless. What proportion of the American public sees it the way you do when it comes to Jewish Americans?
So first of all, Ghida, thank you for having me, and thank you for beginning the conversation in this way and recognizing the division within the American Jewish community and also within the American public. But I would point out that not only is there a division, but actually the majority of Americans, if we start with the American population, do not support the immediate moving or even the moving outside the auspices of a peace agreement with the Palestinians.
And why don't they support it?
Let me just give you an idea of the numbers. According to a poll by the University of Maryland, 31%, only 31% of Americans support the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem outside that auspices. And within the American Jewish community, support is even less than that. According to a poll here I'm citing by the American Jewish Committee, we're not talking about a leftist organization, only 16% of American Jews support the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem outside of at least progress on peace talks between Israel and the
same goes for the recognition of Israel as
that poll is actually about the moving of the embassy.
About the moving of the embassy.
Yes.
When we talk about not just the moving of the embassy, but recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, Morton Klein, you and your organization, the Zionist Organization of America, played a fundamental, quite strong role in lobbying Congress and the Trump administration to make this happen. From an American perspective, though, how does it all further the prospects for peace between Israelis and Palestinians and U.S. interests, for that matter?
Look, first of all, there are legitimate polls showing that by 4-1, Americans, not American Jews, support Jerusalem to being the capital of Israel. Those are legitimate polls, not the push polls that Deborah just mentioned. For 22 years, Israel America has not moved the embassy to Jerusalem. 22 years since the law was passed in 1995. We are further from peace now than ever, even though we've never moved it. Jerusalem is mentioned 700 times in the Bible, in the Jewish Bible, in the Jewish holy books. It is never mentioned in the Quran. When the Arabs controlled Jerusalem from 1948 to 67, it was a slum.
Allow me to say that this is all irrelevant, isn't it? I mean, the fact that it might have been mentioned 700 or 800 times in holy scriptures isn't the basis for international relations and international law, is it?
No. What it shows is Jerusalem is not that holy as a city to Muslims. Mecca and Medina are their holy places, not Jerusalem. And this is very important what Trump did. Now Trump has made it clear to Mr. Abbas that the jig is up. We're not going to accept his nonsense, refusing to negotiate for 8 years. 8 years he's refused to negotiate. He sent a message, Trump has, that radical Islamic terror threats will no longer determine American policy, because if it does, you'll only get more terror threats.
Well,
and from 48 to 67, when the Muslims controlled Jerusalem, let me finish, control Jerusalem, control Jerusalem, they allowed it to become a slum, and they made their capital in Amman, they moved their university to Amman,
I think many would
argue
it was
never
with you.
important to Muslims.
And your understanding of ancient history and what happened when the Muslims were in control of Jerusalem, and the fact that you mentioned that it's not a sacred holy site for Muslims, I think goes against any basic understanding of the importance of Haram Sharif for Muslims and the holy places for Christians as well in Jerusalem.
Right, and look, I think neither Mr. Klein nor I, both of whom represent Jewish organizations, American Jewish organizations, should be the spokespeople of Muslims in terms of what they consider holy as far as Islam goes. It's simply not appropriate, and there's plenty of room to counter the claims that Mr. Klein is making on this front. So I think that's extremely problematic. If we want to find out what Muslim claims are to Jerusalem, we should be talking to Muslims.
And it isn't just Muslims, but Christians as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's right. May I respond to a couple of other things that Mr. Klein had to say? A couple of things. So first of all, the polls that I cited are not push polls. As far as the poll, which I'm not clear on what the provenance is that he cited in terms of U.S. support for Jerusalem being Israel's capital. Let me just say that my organization, Americans for Peace, now also supports Jerusalem being Israel's capital. However, the circumstances for that are absolutely crucial. We support Jerusalem being the capital of Israel, and at the same time being the capital of a new sovereign Palestinian state.
Hold on, but you make the distinction between West and East Jerusalem, because I think that's the crux of the issue. West Jerusalem, most people have no issues with whether Israel considers it its capital or not, but East Jerusalem is the occupied part of Jerusalem.
And exactly what the solution will be for Jerusalem is up to negotiations. Whether it's going to be an Israeli capital in West Jerusalem and a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem, if it will be more of a shared, that is up for negotiations. But absolutely, we support Jerusalem being Israel's capital as it is. As it is de facto now. The question is what happens de jure, of course, in compliance with international law.
So when it comes to international law, Morton Klein, you say that Jerusalem doesn't have a special status, whereas it does. It has been corpus separatum since many UN Security Council resolutions ago. You know that. Israel accepted that. It was in Resolution 181 and so many other resolutions. What is the issue now with accepting the international status of Jerusalem?
Are you a moderator or are you an advocate?
Go ahead, I'm asking you the questions.
Let me ask Deborah. The Palestinian Arabs have been offered a state in 1937, 47, 2000, 2001, 2008. They turned it down all 5 times. And they went to war against Jews, killing Jews. Even their emblem. This is the emblem of the Palestinian Authorities Fatah Party. That's all of Israel. I am speaking.
Mr. Morton,
Stop. Stop
If
interrupting
I may
me.
just bring you
Stop
back
interrupting me.
to
I'm
the
gonna-
issue that we're
you know,
discussing here, which is
look,
Jerusalem today and its importance for American Jews and how it fits within American national interests. I wonder if you can tell us from your perspective whose interest you are defending when you take the position that you have, Israel's or the United States?
I'm agreeing with the President of the United States of America and with the vast majority of Americans who support that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel and the embassy should be moved there. Eastern Jerusalem is the real Jerusalem. Western Jerusalem is the newer part. It's not the historic Jerusalem. The Jewish quarter is in Eastern Jerusalem. All of the government agencies of Israel are in Eastern Jerusalem. And when the Arabs controlled it, not a single Arab leader visited East Jerusalem except King Hussein. That's how unimportant it was. Only when the Jews were able to retain it after the '67 war did the Arabs start screaming about Jerusalem. The PLO Charter doesn't mention the word Jerusalem.
I think that is absolutely not correct. That's
myths.
Not at all. I think what we need to do here, and again, the discussion is about the state of relations among American Jewish people when it comes to this issue, Deborah Shushan. So I don't want us to venture too far away from it. It must say something to us that the entire world has not recognized East Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Now, the United States has, under President Trump. Guatemala has said that it would do the same, but no one else has accepted Jerusalem as an integral part of Israel.
Right. To be clear, the Trump administration has not been clear about exactly what they are recognizing in terms of Jerusalem being Israel's capital. They were deliberately vague about that. Then, of course, the Trump administration said, we're recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, but exactly what that means will be resolved between the parties. However,
but they were quick to mention that they took it off the table as well.
They were. I was going to say that. You're exactly right. They were quick to say that they took it off the table. All right. And so,
So, I mean, where does it leave us in terms of looking towards peace? For you as an American Jewish person, do you think there can be peace with the Israelis without a belief in social justice for all, including the Palestinians, and what they see as their legitimate rights to East Jerusalem?
Right.
How do you see it?
There are obviously clashing claims between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We saw condemnation of Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas because of some of the claims that he made in a speech that he delivered recently. The fact is that we've also seen incendiary speeches from Israel's leaders as well. As much as I very much want to see the rights of Palestinians recognized, I think that that's crucial for a peace between Israel and the Palestinians that Israel desperately needs. But I think what we need to recognize here is that the two sides are not necessarily going to, recognize each other's claims. They're certainly not going to accept each other's narratives. But frankly, that's not necessary.
It's not necessary for peace?
I don't think it's necessary for peace. Good Lord, I wish that it would happen. And after peace happens, hopefully we will see a greater understanding and reconciliation, a discussion of those narratives. But I think in terms of a pragmatic...
Right. Let me allow Morton Klein to respond to you. Go ahead.
Deborah, why hasn't Abbas negotiated for 8 years if he really wants a peace deal? Why did Abbas in his speech say that Jews have no right to Israel whatsoever if he wants a peace deal? Why does Abbas pay Arabs to murder Jews and gives them a salary 4 times what the average Palestinian makes? These are Nazi-like actions. If he's serious about peace and accepting Israel, none of these things would happen. But he refuses to negotiate, he refuses to accept Israel. He names schools, streets, and sports teams after Jew-killing terrorists. This guy has no interest in peace.
But how can you say
these are the types of posters he has for every Jew killer, honoring Jew killers.
He's been negotiating with Israel for all these years, and many would argue that Israel is the one just paying lip service to the peace process, but not willing to make any concessions.
That is a lie. That is a lie.
Well,
he hasn't negotiated in 8 long years.
There have been settlement building that has continued. How do you get peace while you continue to build settlements, for example?
Settlements are less than 2%. Settlements are less than 2% of the West Bank, less than 2%. And Israel hasn't built any new settlements in 24 years. And they built almost no new homes, even within the settlements, in the last 3 years. This is all propaganda.
I would let you counter this because there's so much to be said.
Obviously, Ghida, we are dealing in revisionist history and claims that are simply not true. And there's so much in what
Yeah,
Mr.
and
Klein just said.
where you want to go.
Let me respond to just a few things. Obviously, it's completely not true to say that Mahmoud Abbas has not negotiated in the past 8 years. There were negotiations, of course, that occurred under the auspices of the Obama administration. Now we see President Trump saying that he's going to dramatically cut aid to the Palestinians, including aid to UNRWA, which supports Palestinian refugees, to penalize the Palestinians for not negotiating with Israel when there are no negotiations. We are expecting this amazing peace plan, this deal to end all deals that President Trump is supposed to be putting forth, and we see nothing. There's no opportunity for the Palestinians to negotiate. Meanwhile, we see Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, who claims, or at least claimed in 2009, that he wanted a two-state solution, doing everything possible to undermine it by entrenching the occupation, by building settlements, by greenlighting additional settlements. Where this claim comes that there have been no additional settlements, no home building, I mean, it's simply not true. We hear the repetition of this canard, that settlements occupy less than 2% of the West Bank. Have you never been to the West Bank, Mr. Klein? That's absurd. Even if actual homes in the West Bank compose less than 2% of the population.
You are saying things. You are full of it. You're saying things that are untrue.
Thank you for that very polite characterization of my position.
You're saying things that are completely untrue, Deborah.
So your final thoughts, Morton Klein. Your final thoughts on this?
I think when Mahmoud Abbas will stop showing all of Israel as Palestine, as he does in his emblem, when he stops paying Arabs to murder Jews, when he stops naming school streets and sports teams after Jew-killing terrorists, when he sits down and negotiates with Netanyahu, which he hasn't done for 8 years despite Deborah's falsehoods, then we'll have a chance for peace. Right now, peace is impossible because of the Palestinian authorities' refusal to accept Israel within any borders.
All right, I suppose we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
So to some, Donald Trump has made good on a promise. To others, he has killed the only hope for a peace deal between Israel and Palestine. The president may have overturned 7 decades of US policy and shaken the status quo, but it is now harder than ever to see how the change will help to bring an end to the long-running conflict. The world had been waiting for Trump's grand plan for peace, but Palestinians have lost trust in the United States, and they don't like what they have heard so far about his new ideas. So the occupation goes on. It's now 50 years and counting. Palestinians and Israelis can only hope that peace is achieved long before another half-century is out. In his first year in office, Trump has defiantly and carelessly turned his back on the well-established global consensus on Jerusalem. He's ushered in a new era of instability in the Middle East with a dramatic reduction of US influence and leadership in the region. His approach to foreign policy has shaken international relations and created new tensions. For Israelis and Palestinians, he may well have sounded the death knell to an already dying peace process. Well, that is all from me and the entire team here in Washington, D.C. Goodbye, and thanks for watching.